Good morning, my fellow pilgrims. I call you pilgrims because we're all on this journey of faith together. All right, and I'll give a homily on that when I can find the appropriate readings. All right, as is my custom. All right, 2 nuggets. Some people say, I'm expecting a nugget, so I got to give it to you. All right, the first nugget is a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas. And he asked the question, how do we live in harmony? And then he answers the question by saying, first we have to realize that we are all madly in love with the same God. We have to realize that we are all madly in love with the same God. Remember that thought. Nugget 2. Have you ever heard a gospel that is so depressing as to this gospel? It doesn't hold that much hope, does it? All right? But in order to realize, all right, what that gospel is saying, we have to go to the author. All right, and we know that the author is Luke. Now, Luke is a man who not only wrote this gospel, but he also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. So what do we know about Luke? Now, Scripture scholars, all right, I just want to disclaimer here, I am not a Scripture scholar, nor have I played one on TV. All right, but Scripture scholars believe that Luke was Luke the physician, all right, of Paul's epistles. All right, if he was Paul's disciple, all right, we probably know that he was a Gentile to begin with. And then he converted to Judaism. And as a Jew, all right, he met Paul. And listening to Paul, he asked to be baptized. And Paul thought so much of Luke that he took him on some of his missionary journeys. They also believe, all right, that after he went on missionary journeys with Paul, all right, Luke probably went on his own missionary journeys and probably at some point had a group of priests, a group of cities or communities, all right, that he ministered to. Now, when we think of Luke writing this gospel, we say, why would he put these words in Jesus' mouth? Well, there are 2 things that have now happened before Luke actually wrote his gospel. They think that Luke wrote his gospel between 90 and 100 A.D. 2 things that happened before that time. In 70 A.D., I was going to say 1970. In 70 A.D., all right, the Romans, who had been at war with the Jews and trying to put down their rebellion, actually went into the city Jerusalem and actually destroyed the city. And in doing so, they destroyed the temple. Now, we all know what the temple meant to the Jews, all right? It was the centermost point of their worship. Within the temple was the Holy of Holies. The Jews believed that God actually resided in that Holy of Holies. So when the Romans destroyed the temple, they destroyed the very life and essence of Judaism. All right? Now, this was the second time, all right, that the temple was destroyed. When the Babylonians defeated the Jews in 500 BC, all right, they also destroyed the temple. and they took the Jews into captivity. When the Jews returned from that captivity, they rebuilt the temple. So now this is the second time that the temple is destroyed. Now every time that something catastrophic happens to the Jews, all right, they go into a period of wondering, why did God abandon us? What did we do wrong that God left us? That God let the Romans destroy the temple? And the only thing that they could come up with is that they allowed, all right, the followers of the way, and that's what the Christians were called back then, the followers, they allowed them to worship in the temple and in synagogues. All right, we know from Luke's early writings in the Acts of the Apostles, the first Christians, the first followers of the way, all right, would go to the synagogue and worship with the Jews because they were Jews. And it was after synagogue worship that they would go to each other's houses and celebrate the Eucharist, which was particular to them. So when you take away the synagogue worship from these Christians, you are taking away something that is very particular and very important to them. And that is what happened when the Jews said that the Christians were no longer welcomed in the synagogues. And that happened in 88 A.D. All right, so the Jews kicked out the Christians from worshiping in the synagogue. So Luke sees this. And Luke says, my people are hurting. So Luke writes this gospel story. And in this gospel story, what Luke is saying is that the hubris, all right, the overconfidence of the Jews, thinking that they were the chosen ones, all right, that they only had the only relationship with God, and that everyone else didn't. And as a result, they could kick the Christians out. So Luke takes that and he writes this particular section of the gospel. And in doing so, he's saying, listen, he's saying to his own people, listen, the Jews think that they have the truth, all right? What Jesus is telling them is that they don't have the truth. They are not the only way, all right? And when it comes time for the judgment, all right, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will be welcomed into the kingdom, all right? But for the Jews, it's going to be very hard for them to get into the kingdom. They're going to come to me and they're going to say, we knew you. You walked our streets. You preached to us. And Jesus is going to say, I don't know where you're from. So, what does this mean for Luke's people? All right, it gives them a little bit of hope. And in the last part of the gospel, all right, where Jesus' words are, the people are going to come from the east and the west. They're going to come from the north and the south. And they're going to recline at the table. Those words meant the Gentiles from the east and the west, the north and the south, were going to be able to recline at the table in God's kingdom, whereas the Jews were going to have a very hard time getting to God's kingdom. All right? And the very last sentence is something that we all have repeated and probably in our own lives. All right? The first, the Jews, will be last. The last, the Gentile Christians, will be first. All right, so if we look at that, or if we look at Luke's meaning for this gospel, all right, we can see that it's really a gospel of hope and not despair. All right? It is hope for us as Christians. Now, what I want to say is, what does that mean to us today? We'll go back to Nugget 1. Thomas Aquinas lived in the 1200s. When Thomas Aquinas lived, there were three major religions: the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. All right? Thomas Aquinas lived before the Reformation. All right? So there were no Protestants. All right? Thomas Aquinas looks at the situation and he says, how can we three live in harmony? And then he says, we all must realize that we are all madly in love with the same God. What does that mean? That means that the God that we are worshiping today, that we are praying to right now, is the very same God, all right, that up the block on Whitesville Road, all right, if you drive down from 571, on the right-hand side of the road, you will notice that there is a congregation of cars parked outside of the house. All right? Those are Jewish people, Jewish men who have come together for Sunday school. Their Sabbath is on Saturday. All right? But very devout Jews who come together for Sunday school, all right, to read the scriptures and to pray. That is what they are doing at this very moment. Are we to believe that our prayer is the only prayer that God hears right now? Are we to believe that when they pray, that God is going, go ahead, Kitty, I want to hear you. Can we believe that? Less than a mile away, on Route 9, is a mosque. Do we believe that our God only hears us and does not hear their prayer? So what Thomas is saying, all right, and what our message is today, right, is that we are all praying to the same God. Our God, our Trinity, is the same God as their Yahweh. Our Trinity is the same God as their Allah. So my prayer for all of us this morning is that we will always appreciate and honor another person's religion, because they are praying to our God. We pray to their God. As Thomas says, it's everybody's God.